Hey, this is lovely to be all with you here. It's a full morning. We're going to have to duck out at about a little after quarter after. So is that normal?
Yeah.
Oh, right? Great.
We all abandoned.
You all abandoned.
We'll all be
I do not want to abandon. So this is the first of two sessions on the Psalms. So the title that I gave was "We Start at the Very Beginning." It's a very good place to start. The first book, or the first song book for the church is the Psalms. And there's a kind of interesting history for us as Lutherans of psalmody and the role of psalm singing large and long ago, but also relatively recently for us. And so I thought I'd do some exploration and some history on this. A lot of what I think if you were here a couple weeks ago when I gave an overview of what we would be doing or what I would be doing for this session, I talked about this as part of a research project that I did in graduate school. And I was very fortunate to have a very important primary source, Mark Pangert, who Mark was a colleague of mine and taught at the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago, and at Christ Seminary Seminex back in the day, and I think was involved at Mount Olive in the 70s when he was working on his doctoral work at U of M. I think he wrote his, or did something, I remember him saying he wrote part of his exam in Almanz's office. Yeah. Which is now, he would find great humor that it's now the diaper depot.
He was fairly often a substitute organist here when Paul Mons was out of town.
Oh, I didn't know he played the organ all that well. Is that news to you, Bob? So he was a member, I will be using a lot of acronyms, ILCW, ALC, LCA, ELC, LCMS, all that kind of stuff. And he was part of the Commission on Worship, the Inter-Lutheran Commission on Worship that helped write and develop the 1978 Green Book, the LBW. We'll do some show and tell. This is now an artifact. Does that make you feel old, Bob? So anyway, this is mine with my boss name on it. So anyway, and Mark was he was part of the ILCW, and he was most importantly part of the subgroup that developed the Psalter and the daily prayer rites in the book. And I was fortunate to sit at a table with him halfway between Chicago and South Bend over lunch, and maybe a gin and tonic, I don't remember, and got a thorough oral history of his work. So a lot of the historical bits are direct from the horse's mouth. Mark, who has gone on to the other side of the veil and is singing songs at the throne of God right now. But he was a dear, dear friend, and very grateful that I had that opportunity. So I'm going to read from bits from my research here, and I will probably interject and stop along the way. If there are things that you don't like, what is an office? I don't assume that everybody knows what all the words that may come up. So no shame in saying, can you clarify that? This is not just simply talk at you, though I'm going to be doing a lot of talking at you. So be sure to raise your hand when the Spirit moves. In 1978 marked the beginning of a new era of Lutheran worship in North America. The sweeping liturgical reforms of the Second Vatican Council coincided with an ecumenical reevaluation of liturgical rites, and North American Lutherans, feeling the same impetus for fresh air, produced Lutheran Book of Worship. More than a hymnal, this liturgical book and its related volumes sought to unite diverse branches of Lutheran piety and Lutheran expression, and liturgical expression. Its rites were designed to bring modernity to Lutheran congregations and to achieve a sense of unity without imposing uniformity. It reflected a new wave of liturgical and biblical scholarship that looked anew at ancient liturgical forms and offered corrective of sort to some of the received traditions. Musically, it sought to enable the Lutheran liturgical birthright of full voice participation using a modern North American accent. Fidelity to the historic orders of the Mass and to Luther's two major revisions of the Mass from the 1520s, the Formula Missae, which was the most conservative of his thoughts on the Mass, and the German Mass, the more what we've often done here with the chorale tunes. The fidelity to those historic orders throughout North America really ran the gamut, from those who followed these models carefully, to those who viewed them as important insights, all the way to those who abandoned it entirely, adopting a more generic free church approach. Many of these liturgical variations had their roots in Europe. Germans and Norwegians essentially split into two liturgical styles, free church and high church. Swedes were uniformly, well, generally, more liturgical and somewhat hierarchical in structure, with the exception of some splinter groups here and there. Danes and Finns were somewhere in the middle, etc. So you can kind of trace all these developments. Of course, there's always exceptions to all of these rules. Generalization is a generalization, not always helpful, but generally there. As they continued to colonize the continent, these European Americans often chose to reflect an American or kind of a generic Protestant liturgical practice in order to assimilate into this new land. This broad diversity, essentially, in one way, became a hindrance to Lutheran unity of sorts. Luther's Book of Worship was to be the culmination of centuries of liturgical convergence on the American continent. And part of the story of this convergence can be traced through the Psalms and their use within worship. Martin Luther's identity as an Augustinian friar shaped his spiritual and theological life. His weekly journey as a monk would have led him through the Psalter in the daily office of morning prayer and evening prayer and all the offices that monks would pray each day. He wrote, "The Psalter ought to be a dear and beloved book, if only because it promises Christ's death and resurrection so clearly, and so typifies his kingdom and the condition and nature of all Christendom, that it might well be called a little Bible." For Luther, this biblical center of the believer's heart was not the singular source for congregational song like Calvin. Calvin and his descendants thought that only the Psalms should be sung in Christian worship. There was no room for hymnody of really any sort. For Luther, it remained in its traditional liturgical role in the rites of daily prayer and in the Eucharist. However, as monastic communities disbanded during the Reformation era and in those Reformation lands, corporate clerical worship declined and vernacular hymnody really took hold. The role of psalmody in Lutheran worship was not as strong as it once was. Introits and graduals. The introit is a chant at the beginning of worship, a set assigned text, often a verse or two of a psalm, and a gradual would be kind of the remnant of what we have now today as the psalm, kind of appended to the Alleluia. It was kind of a mashup of things. You know what? Introits and graduals. They were often supplanted by hymnody, and spoken psalmody in the vernacular became somewhat normative in places that still prayed a daily office. The inroads of pietism and rationalism also affected Lutheran liturgical worship, and as various practices became locally and regionally adapted, Lutheran masses, as we go from Luther to the 19th century, say, began to look less and less like their 16th century roots. When European Lutherans came ashore to North America, they now find themselves not only separated by culture and language, but by worship and liturgy. In walks Henry Melchior Muhlenberg. Came to North America in 1742, incidentally was ordained at St. Thomas Church in Leipzig, and likely maybe, possibly, had J.S. Bach as the organist at his ordination. That fun fact. Who's the Luther scholar at Philadelphia Seminary who retired? Mark, yes. Wenger. Timothy Wenger, yeah. Tim mentioned that to me once. So I think that's almost as close to the horse's mouth as He came to North America in 1742 to bring order to a Lutheran landscape, divided by competing liturgical pieties and ecclesiastical orientations. Through the Lutheran Ministerium of Pennsylvania, an attempt at a unified American Lutheran liturgy for the colonies was adopted in 1748 and was essentially a mixture of existing German and Anglican rites. Muhlenberg constantly expressed hope that one day American Lutherans would be united, sharing a common liturgy and hymnal. As the U.S. encroached further west and as European settlers came flooding in over the next century, Lutheran worship still remained pretty divided along ethnic lines. It wasn't until the development of the common service in 1881 that most English-speaking Lutherans could finally share a common English worship order and liturgy. The primary forces behind its development were sympathetic to liturgical reform movements concurrently happening in England and in Germany. It drew again heavily on the Anglican Book of Common Prayer for its language and feel, and restored much of a traditional Eucharistic rite in form and substance. It standardized the use of a set of propers, assigned text and readings, and included in that were introits and graduals, canticles at morning and evening prayer, and set forth, again, a kind of a Lutheran corrective to some of the Calvinistic and Free Church influences that kind of dominated what American Protestantism writ large seemed to be. The common service would provide a basic structure for a majority of Lutherans in North America for nearly 100 years. It wasn't in one common hymnal, but it appeared in almost all of the various Lutheran hymnals. Kind of a great achievement. Even though the common service had returned various uses of psalms to Lutheran rites, their application was not what we know now. It wasn't until 1901 that a psalter was published, a complete psalter, was published with pointing for singing using the ancient Gregorian psalm tones. The book Psalter and Canticles Pointed for Chanting to the Gregorian Psalm Tones was compiled by Harry Archer and Luther Reed. If you are a liturgical nerd in the Lutheran land, you know who Luther D. Reed is, or you should. Luther Reed was variously interested in a lot of things, and liturgy, and he was a seminary president and writer of liturgical books, and musician and organist, all of these things. Led a very interesting life. It was a comprehensive volume containing all 150 psalms. It used the authorized version, the King James version, which is different than what the Anglicans were using. And it contained a complete set of Old and New Testament canticles used in morning and evening prayer. Reed claimed that this was the first complete plain song psalter published using the King James Version. There were no doubt other psalters in use that had been published for use by Anglicans using the Coverdale translations, or the further adaptations of the Coverdale translation of the Psalms, which I believe first appeared in 1535 or so, thereabout, give or take. But this was the first complete sung psalter for use by Lutherans in North America. So that's kind of a big deal in 1901 already. Luther D. Reed was a central figure in this first wave of Lutheran liturgical renewal in the early 20th century, not only through his seminary teaching and scholarship, but he produced a lot of liturgical material for use by Lutherans across Lutheran denominational lines. Books of introits and graduals appeared under his guidance in 1901 and 1924. This is Matthews. I don't think do I have the Lutheran Reed one? Yes, this is the 1924 Introits and Graduals, Advent to Whit Sunday. We should call it Whit Sunday again. That sounds so fun. The Gesimas, all that stuff. So these had a composed introit, refrain, and then the psalm text, the one or two verses of psalmody that would appear as the verse was set to a chant tone, and then a newly composed antiphon, beginning and end, was written by Reed or Thomas Matthews, I believe, no, H. Alexander Matthews, not Matthews. So this is published in 1924. I do not have a copy of the 1901 book, so I need to scour used books. Though it is available online, which is great. Reed was also chair of the Joint Commission on Liturgy and Hymnal for the American Lutheran Church and the Lutheran Church in America, and was a central figure in the production of the 1958 service book, Hymnal. For those of you raised in the LCMS, you had no idea what that hymnal was. Everybody told, oh, the old red book. Oh, I know, the 1941. No, 1958. So these were the two books kind of going on at the time. I believe I was baptized under the SPH. I think still doing. Yes, I would have. Yeah.
It's valid.
Yeah.
What?
Then it's valid.
That's valid. Yeah. Yeah, that's great. I grew up in a household that's still wistful. My mother is still wistfully, oh, the old SB, and she was SBNH. Just never really loved that green book, but now she loves the green book because I don't quite know about that green book. But anyways, I always wistfully go for the past. It's always better than
A wise woman.
yeah. Composers and liturgists working in other branches of Lutheranism in America produced collections of introits and graduals for use with the common service at various times. In the LCMS, Albert Christensen produced a collection of introits to Gregorian psalm tones in 1939. These are some of them. This is Arthur Carl Picorn's copy. If you know who that name is, it's autographed by A.O. Christensen. I don't know where I got that from. And this is another one of that. These were used in the LCMS in the early 20th century. A collection with the service book and hymnal, two collections of introits and graduals were composed. One was a set of chant. This was put out by Augsburg back in the day, 1960s, 1960 and 61. This was Series A, which was chant, and then a series of choral introits and graduals, including composers such as Paul J. Christiansen, Olaf Christiansen, Paul Mons, and Paul Fettler, amongst other people, Richard Gore, all of these, G. Winston Kassler, all of these names from an era gone by. Fun fact, the introit for Advent 1 is by Mons, and when my brother and I did a Paul Mons hymn festival for the Bloomington, Indiana chapter of the AGO back when my brother was working in Bloomington, Paul and Ruth, I think it was amongst the last time that they got out of town on an airplane, and they went to this hymn fest, and we honored them, and I used this Advent 1 introit, and Paul was just, did I write that? I kind of vaguely remember. I don't think I've ever heard it. So we premiered and it's lovely. In fact, I'm going to try to use it for the Advent procession this year. So talk about obscure music that somehow gets collected. You know, these books accumulate, you know, and these were all in our basement until we moved here. Now my wife is so happy that they have a home in an office. So, what do you need those for? Like, well, you never know. And, let's see. All right. This series complemented another collection. Oh yeah, I already said that. These are chant and these are choral. In 1960 and in 1967, respectively, Paul Punges in the LCMS and Healy Willen did these two books of introits and graduals. I reference all of these in introits and graduals because this was the extent of what psalm singing, or the psalms themselves, had within Lutheran worship at this time. Herbert Lindemann in the LCMS, the influential Sunday Psalter from 1961, was the first to combine the psalms and their Gregorian psalm tones with the adaptations of the antiphons from the Liber Usualis. Liber Usualis is the big, fat collection of most of the chants that a Roman Catholic would need historically for each Sunday and feast day, and much of the daily lectionary as well. The compendium, wait a second. Okay, like Archer and Reed's 1901 Psalter, this Sunday Psalter was aimed at Lutheran congregations or schools that prayed morning or evening prayer, either daily or as their principal Sunday liturgy. Eucharistic rites were still based upon the common service, which did not have the traditional full psalm as a response to the readings. I learned about this from Mark. He said this was highly influential to his and his circle in the LCMS. And I'd say it was the first sung psalter regularly used by those who would later be responsible for the LDW. So it's important. And this is the Herbert Lindemann Book of Daily Prayer. So you could have all the readings of a daily office. So this is a lovely little book that I inherited.
Yeah, I know that one of the features of the daily office are the litanies that he puts in there. But that is amazing. It's off the topic of Psalter, but that's one of my favorite books because of the litanies that he has put in there.
I learned that Herbert Lindemann maybe lived like 3 or 4 blocks away from where our house was in Fort Wayne. Mark didn't know. I think I had a drink at his house once, so. Of course. In spite of the abundance of resources for both psalmody and sung propers by the mid-20th century, the practice of congregational psalm singing was not widespread. Lutheran congregations often had the practice of responsive reading of the psalms in the daily office. Most liturgical or high church settings, the choir did not have a specific liturgical function, and they were singing special music. Again, these are broad generalizations. There's always exceptions to these historically. At morning or evening prayer, the appointed psalms were often just read by the pastor, functioning or at least appearing like a reading, and not as the musical heart of the daily office. If the congregation was to say or sing anything at this point in the office, it was to respond with the glory be to the Father and the Son. The same held true at Eucharist. The preparatory rites of the entrance rite would have a hymn and a confession. Pastor would speak the words of the assigned introit, with the congregation responding with a sung or spoken glory be to the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Such differing practices reflected the wide divergence of pieties that marked American Lutheranism 200 years after Muhlenberg. It was the fervor of the 60s and its social and political upheaval and the dramatic liturgical changes ushered in by the Second Vatican Council that North American Lutherans began to dream, along with Muhlenberg, of a unified church, drawn together by a common hymnal. In its 1965 convention in Detroit, the LCMS took the bold step of issuing a call for a new inter-Lutheran hymnal. Since 1953, the LCMS had been formally discussing revisions to the Lutheran hymnal of 1941. Leaders in the other two major North American Lutheran bodies, the ALC and the LCA, had expressed some degree of dissatisfaction soon after the publication of Service Book and Hymnal. There was a distinct yearning for new music and for fresh relevance to the changing cultural landscape. Despite the separate nature of these three church bodies, musicians and liturgical scholars and leaders often had frequent opportunities for exchange. It was in this ecumenical context that it became clear the time was ripe for a new shared worship book. Since ALC and LCA had just come off a new hymnal project, and with LCMS further along in its work, it was decided that the LCMS would make the formal overture to the other synods. In early 1967, the first meeting of the Inter-Lutheran Commission on Worship, I just love that name, Inter-Lutheran Commission, the ILCW, was held with representatives of not only the ALC, LCA, and LCMS, but the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Canada, and the Slovak, or the Synod of Evangelical Lutheran Churches, which would soon be folded into the LCMS. It must be noted, which is separate from the Slovak Zion Synod, which is folded into the ELCA. So, when two come together, one always goes this way. So. It must be noted that the concept of a new hymnal and worship book was not merely due to enthusiasm for liturgical and musical renewal. The post-war years saw a renewed energy in cooperation and the working through of theological differences between the various churches. The ALC and LCA had just been formed in 1960 and 1962, respectively, due in no small part to their cooperation of their 7 predecessor bodies on service book and hymnal. European ethnic identities were softening, especially in the years after World War II, and notions of unity were very much in the air. If Lutherans could do the hard work of producing a common hymnal, it was believed the other barriers to unity could eventually be brought down. If we can sing together and pray together, maybe we can do other things together. According to my friend Mark, a member of ILCW, the ILCW was not necessarily formed initially to produce a book, like a giant editorial committee, but to be the locus of the first realistic attempts at developing a common North American Lutheran identity. It's interesting that it came through worship, or eventually came to be through worship. With this focus on unity at the fore, new worship resources and energy toward a new book of worship eventually won out. For 9 years, various subcommittees populated by representatives from the 4 major churches met and discussed countless topics related to new and revised rites and music. The work on psalmody kind of accidentally fell to the daily prayer subcommittee formed in 1973. Though the Psalter itself was not part of their mandate initially, the organic development of the ILCW meant no single committee had been specifically tasked with answering this question of psalms. The committee, realizing that the Psalter was the heart of the daily offices, just took it on themselves to ask the fundamental questions about a Psalter in this new book. I guess in the absence of directive, it's like, okay, it's ours now. Their discussion first centered on the question of text. The King James Version had been the source of biblical language in predecessor hymnals, yet one of the main objectives of such a new book in liturgy was to fully embrace modern English and to avoid archaic forms of speech. The committee examined psalms from both the Revised Standard Version, the RSV, the Jerusalem Bible, which had recently become the standard English translation for American Catholics. The Psalter translation, known as the Grail, was also used by American Catholics as their translation for sung psalmody, and it was well received by numerous Old Testament scholars, and was noted by the committee for its singable nature. However, they eventually decided on the revised Coverdale translation, published in 1973 as part of the proposals for the new American Episcopal Book of Common Prayer that eventually was authorized in 1979. Miles Coverdale's Psalter translation traces its roots to 1535 and the first Book of Common Prayer in 1549. Since then, it has been altered numerous times to correct, clarify, and remove obsolete words. The 1973 version not only updated the language from its 1928 revision, but also improved its fidelity to the Hebrew original. The committee was struck primarily by its singability and speakability, and was intrigued by possible future collaborations on resources with the Episcopal Church. The Grail translation, which is still widely used, was ultimately determined to be problematic because of its versification system, how they numbered the verses. It's kind of a strange decision. They're like, well, we don't like how they versed it. So, but they were also, and this is very, very Lutheran. They were wary about its sudden and recent popularity. So we're going to go to the 1535. They wanted to avoid, this is from Mark himself, they wanted to avoid falling prey to a possible fad, and in the end, some of the phrases in the Grail translation rang as, quote, too precious to the ears of the committee members. So take that as it were. With the text of the Psalter decided, the committee then had to address the more difficult issue of how to sing them. Again, 3 different systems were examined. At one stage, the thought was given to including 3 separate pointing systems, so the little marks or hashes or slashes. So to have 3 different systems for 3 different methods of chanting, all in one body of text. Mark said this proved almost comically impossible. Yeah, this degree of openness to new ideas really, I think, shows the spirit of experimentation that permeated the ISCW. The seemingly natural choice of using the historic Gregorian psalm tones, which became known to American Lutherans in 1901 with Luther Reed, raised significant problems for the committee. They were concerned about the musical and textual compromises needed to fit English accents to the Gregorian chant tones, which the formulas really dovetail beautifully with how Latin functions as a language. And I have a whole section here about comparing and contrasting that. We'll talk about that next week when we look at some of those ancient psalm tones. So we'll skip over that. The importance of text accents and the difficulty in achieving a satisfactory result that could easily be used by congregations was the committee's primary reason for abandoning the historic Latin tones. A new psalm tone system developed by Joseph Gelano, which made use of the Grail translation's sprung meter, so how the text kind of rhymed along, was also determined to be too melodically complicated for congregations. And I have some examples up here of that. Given the limited size of the book, they would have added significant numbers of pages of music and text. In the mix of ecumenical sources being consulted for the new book was the Simple Gradual for Sundays and Holy Days from 1969, was compiled for use by English Catholics. It included psalm tones by Gelano and a new system developed by Benedictine musicians and monks A. Gregory Murray and Lawrence Bevanot. Their tones consisted of a reciting note, 2 bridge or cadence notes, and a final. Sound familiar? Long note, 2 moving notes, and a last note. So, and I have an example up here which I can, if someone wants to pass these little handouts out. I'm just going to look at you too because you're close. You can see 3 different psalm tones essentially. The middle one is the Gelano system, and then the top one and the bottom one are Bevanot and Murray, as you can see by the BEV and the MUR at the bottom there. And you can see how these work. And we'll explore this next week with actually singing through some of these things. So this system like lit a light bulb and a fire under the committee and under Mark in particular. He was jazzed by this. What it did is that because the final accent of the text ended up landing very well on the very last note. The 3 psalm tone, this simple system which eventually became adopted, alleviated the complications of irregular accents in English, generally, by placing the final accents of text on a single note at the end, whereas some of the Gregorian psalm tones have moving notes at the end, and the text accents with English do not always really work well.
Yeah.
The committee became intrigued by this elegant and simple solution to their desire for a congregational psalter, easily understood by lay people, and consistently applicable to each psalm. They began to experiment with writing their own tones in the style of Murray and Pevino, and were included in the publication of trial use materials. Contemporary Worship 9, this is an antique, Daily Prayer of the Church from 1976 was one of the 10 volumes of proposed liturgical material used and evaluated by congregations before the publication of LBW. In addition to the daily offices, suffrages, and the Great Litany, it contained a small selection of psalms, 4 sample psalm tones, and different systems of pointing for evaluation. The work of the committee was well received after a few minor changes, and it appeared in Lutheran Book of Worship in 1978. Psalmody in LBW. The 2 major psalm-related changes to Lutheran Eucharistic worship were also informed by the post-Vatican II Mass. The first was a return to an ancient structure of the liturgy of the Word. Readings from the Old Testament, New Testament, and Gospels were standard in early Armenian, Post-Arabic, Hellenese, and Gallican rites, and the revised Roman Mass restored this practice to the modern era. Lutheran Book of Worship adopted essentially an identical model. Psalmody was now to be sung in response to the first reading with the simple rubrical directive that said, the appointed psalm is sung or said. For perhaps the first time in the history of English language worship books, a congregation of lay people could turn to a psalm appointed for singing, and using the tones in the book, could sing the entire book of Psalms. Now, Calvinists and others had been using metrical psalmody, that is, rhyming paraphrases of the Psalms to fit the meter of a hymn tune for centuries. Monks and monastic communities had breviaries and the Liber Usualis. Newer Catholic hymnals were full of psalm antiphons, but the LBW gave the entirety of a sung psalter to the people. Unlike other similar liturgical traditions, the full psalm could now be the response of the entire assembly, not merely the work of the choir or relegated to a short antiphon. This was a bold, aspirational move that affirmed the psalter as belonging to the people, reinforcing Luther's notion of the church as the, quote, mouth house, where the word of God is an oral, proclaimed word, rooted in the heart of the faithful through music and song. The second psalm-related change in LBW was perhaps less dramatic. As mentioned above, actually maybe it was more fairly dramatic. As mentioned above, Lutheran usage of the classical medieval introits with their antiphon, psalm verse, and Gloria Patri was not a common or well-developed musical event in North American Lutheranism, despite these great books and resources. By re-examining the introit's historical development and ancient roots, and even Luther's own expressed desire for singing a complete psalm at the beginning instead of just one verse, the introit as a liturgical entrance proper ceased to exist in the LBW, with one exception. The entrance rite now included a simpler, expansive rubric. The entrance hymn or psalm is sung. This allowed for so-called classic introits to still be sung in those few places where the practice was loved and used, but it also acknowledged the centuries-long practice of a congregational hymn marking the musical beginning of a Lutheran Mass. The assigned texts for an entrance psalm, however, were not given in the assigned text for each week. The appointed psalm was only for use in liturgy of the word. The gradual, itself a kind of a remnant of the ancient psalm response between readings and melded together with the Alleluia, while being formally removed in name, was in essence restored to its fullness as a psalm and Alleluia. The LBW included a new provision for a sung proper offertory verse as the gifts were brought forward. While not always a psalm text, these select verses of scripture were related to the themes of the season or the day. These were modeled, I think, in an attempt on the Roman Rite, which has assigned offertory antiphons and assigned communion antiphons. No musical provision for singing these texts, and there were only a relative handful of published choral resources, given the proper offertory verse never really achieved widespread adoption amongst Lutherans. And the idea of a proper communion antiphon for Lutherans was not even given consideration. The inclusion of psalmody in the daily prayer liturgies of Matins, Vespers, and Compline was retained, but with the sung psalter in LBW, it was now possible for the psalms to return as the musical core of the offices. 10 psalm tones were provided using the method that was developed. 5 single tones, so one measure and then another measure, were composed by Mark Bangert, and 5 double psalm tones were composed by Richard Hillert. They provided differing melodic and modal melodies that could be appropriately paired with the mood of the psalm. Initially, Mark said, these tones were written and designed to be sung without accompaniment. But it was determined later on in the editorial process that smaller congregations with minimal musical resources would more likely adopt this method if simple accompaniments were provided. While sung antiphon texts were provided in the propers for each day, no musical provisions were made for them except where a local composer would write them. Wrapping up. It wasn't until the late 90s when a complete set of psalm settings with melodic antiphons and refrains was produced as a complementary resource to LBW. Aftermath and conclusions. During the final year before its publications, the LCMS, of course, formally withdrew from their participation in the LBW. 1970s, this is all not news to you. The 70s were a time of intense theological and ecclesiastical debate in the LCMS. The divide between theological perspectives split the church. So in 1988, the ELCA was formed through a merger of the ALC, the LCA, and the folks that left the LCMS. And in no doubt, I think those were brought together in fact by the LBW itself. And then in 2006, ELW was brought forward and maintained the same system of psalm singing, essentially unchanged with an inclusivized rendering of the psalm text themselves. This psalm text is produced by the ELW team, of which Bob is here, was on that team, was adopted by the Presbyterian Church USA for use in their new hymnal. The LCMS produced their own hymnal in 1982, Lutheran Worship, basically lifted most of LBW's work, with the exception of they decided to tweak, I need to get this history from Joe Hurl, but the psalm tone method is not exactly the same, where sometimes they have one word or one syllable over those two moving notes, and sometimes there's two syllables over the loop. Anyway, they just had to be different, you know. And so both the successor books, ELW, and the Lutheran Service book in the LCMS retained the singing psalms. With the publication of these books, North American Lutherans entered, as I say, a brave new era of liturgy. One that was intentionally modern and rooted in the expanding Lutheran confessional identity. It was an aspirational book. Its dramatic, musical, and liturgical departure from what preceded it demonstrated the Church's challenge to itself for relevancy and renewal, while at the same time re-examining its own Lutheran history. Informed by the work of the Second Vatican Council and the spirit of ecumenism that flowered in its wake, the ILCW addressed the fundamental questions of the liturgical renewal movement with the hopeful spirit of modernity. LBW offered a unique Lutheran voice to the emerging ecumenical consensus on Christian liturgy and restored the fullness of the Psalms as the poetic and musical heart of the faithful. So that is a very hurried and brief overview of psalmody in Lutheran. So next week we will sing through many different styles of psalm singing, and so get your voices on. Joseph.
Do you have enough seconds to explain a little bit of their thinking by not including the entire Psalter in LBW? Bring it back, Neil, but I mean, I'm sure it had to do with which got appointed in the lectionary,
Yeah,
but what, did Mark talk about
I
that?
didn't ask him, but I could assume, actually maybe I did ask him that, I think, I'm recalling that.
I mean, we assumed it was largely the ones that were saying really nasty things.
Yes.
Probably, or the ones that were just not used in
Yeah.
a lectionary, yeah. David.
Couple comments from a person who grew up with the service book and hymnal mostly. The thing I always found most jarring, particularly when I became an adult, was in a fairly high level of theological education, was the archaic language in the Psalms, because the service book and hymnal was conspicuous for having updated the language in the liturgy of the Psalms. And the Psalms within that really became jarring because of the archaic language. He maketh the hinds the calf. Who knows what that means? But another point was that apparently there wasn't a lot of receptivity to new things during the period that hymnal was in use. Because that hymnal did include a number of new hymns and new hymn tunes. There were several by Lutheran Saturday. They are all gone now. None of them made it into the, as far as I know, none of them made it into the LBW. And I think it was because the ILCW adopted the method of surveying congregations as to what hymns were used and which were not, and they simply discarded ones that weren't.
Yeah.
So I think the congregations just weren't receptive to trying these things.
Yeah. If you want to take a gander at any of these books, if the last person out of the room could just put them back in the kitchen. You can, I need to run off to choir, so you can take a look through these all, and thank you all. We'll see you next week. What would we do? We could talk about the weather. So last week, we had a very fast and very fast overview of psalmody and psalm singing and the development of psalm singing, the psalm singing style in Lutheran Book of Worship and Evangelical Lutheran Worship by extension. We didn't have time for much questions or conversation after that, so now's the time. If you have any burning thoughts, I have one anecdote that I want to share about that at some point, kind of as a button at the end of that, and then what we'll do is explore in your packet of material all manner and style of psalms that you can, actually, do I have the right? Yes, I do. All manner of stuff that we'll sing through just as a fun exercise to explore all the different ways in which psalms are sung in Christian communities around the world, at least in the English-speaking world, for what we have here. Any questions about last week and the development of the LBW Psalter and Psalms within Lutheranism? So one fun story. So my late former colleague Mark Pankert, who was, I think, probably, if there's one person who's probably the most influential in the development of the Psalter in Lutheran Book of Worship, there's two fun if you're a church nerd. So the Psalter and all the little markings of pointing in the Psalter for where the moving notes would go in Lutheran Book of Worship, they got the galley copies And it was going to press pretty soon, and they needed a chance to sing. They thought, we need to actually sing through all of the Psalms to make sure that we got it right. And Mark Bangert and Gracia Grindal sat in a hotel room near O'Hare and sang all 150 Psalms during the worship, which is an image that I relish. And he had nothing but great things to say. Like, it was a great experience. They found a few mistakes and fixed those. Bob Farley is not here. There were a couple mistakes in ELW, so. One actually, which was last Sunday, in the first edition of the book, one of them is in the wrong place. So, yeah. The second is, the proofs had been sent off to the publisher and it was in process, and Mark thought, you know what, I should send this on to my colleague. I believe it was Brother Columba Kelly, who is was a big name in chant scholarship in the Catholic Church. He worked and lived at St. Heinrad's Abbey. I believe that's in Indiana. I should know that, I just came to Indiana. St. Meinrad's, and Mark sent off the Psalter to him just to have him look at it and say, well, how do you make of it? And he was very complimentary, thought that this was a great idea. He said, but you have one error. And Mark was like, oh crap, what is the one error? And he said, some of the psalm tones, you have your reciting note, and then the two moving notes, if the first one goes up, is at a higher pitch than the reciting tone, you run the risk, based on the text, of having an accented, unaccented syllable. So like, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. So is doesn't fall naturally. The Lord is my shepherd. Shepherd is the accented syllable at the end of the line. And the psalm tones that Mark wrote, the psalm tone 1 in LBW was that one. Da, 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 dee, da, da, da. You ready to remember that? I was the first one I ever sang. And he's like, if I could take anything back in this world, I would take that psalm tone away. But that's the one that because it was number 1, everybody sang that one forever for a while. And so it was too late to excise that from the book. Now, Mark never really shared that information with other people who write psalm tones, such as myself, and sometimes you do get an accented, unaccented syllable if the first moving note goes up, but now I can't unsee it. So, also, Bob Farley's not here too. Yeah, some of the psalm tones in ELW break that rule too, so Mark never really shared that information widely, so those are fun facts about developments of hymnals that I think show and prove that they are written by human beings and who have great care and thought, and as knowledge gets gained, we learn all manner of things, and then the next edition we always hope is an improvement.
Only God is perfect.
There it is. So in your packet, I'm going to sing through a variety of songs. Last week I talked about Gelano, Joseph Gelano, or I've heard some people say Gelanu, but I don't think that's right, Gelano, developed a method of song tones that fit with the early English translation called the Grail. The Ladies of the Grail. I don't really know anything about them, but that's what you see in the line of the text, that they developed a psalter using sprung meter. So if you look at this first psalm, Psalm 27, you see the text of the psalm here, and what it's meant, what I believe it means by sprung meter, is that the text of the rhythm kind of has a bounce to it. So like, the Lord is my light and my salvation, whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life, whom should I dread? So the translation was geared towards having that kind of groupings of either 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 syllables that kind of bounce along, okay? So what Gelano devised was kind of the opposite of what we know as a psalm tone, where we have a reciting note, where we have one note where we just say a bunch of words on it and no rhythm. This is the opposite. We have a rhythmic note and we squeeze the words to fit that rhythm. And you can have one syllable, if it's an accented syllable, 2 syllables, which I guess would equal 2 half notes. And then you could have 4 syllables within one of these long notes. That would be divided up into quarter notes, essentially. But then there's the problem of what do you do with 3 syllables? Now there are 2 schools of thought. One which is long, short, so half, quarter, or quarter, half. I was told at my alma mater, Notre Dame, no triplets ever. So you have, the Lord is my light. The ixnay would be, the Lord is my light and my salvation. That's just a little too... Says the university with golden domes. So how to decipher? I first saw this. Do you remember the Maroon Hymnal Supplement 91 put up by GIA? That's one of the Catholic publishing houses. There was some Jellicoe Psalms in there, and as a high school church nerd, I was like, "What is this?" I could not figure out what it meant until finally somebody sat down and explained it to me. So the notes in parentheses are for the accompaniment. That's the downbeat. Okay. When you have an upbeat syllable, you basically count from the end of the measure back. So you see on this verse 1, the is the only syllable in that measure. So you can either do that as a quarter note or a half note. So the Lord is my light. Or you could do it as the Lord is my light. Now when you have 2 syllables, like on verse 3, though and, you could do, actually you really have to do a half note. Or actually 2 quarter notes. Though an army encamp against. It's kind of like talking, well, I won't say it. It's like talking about an activity rather than doing it. Okay? It's far harder to describe it than to just do it. Okay? So let's actually just read the text of verse 1 and verse 2, and then we'll explain verse 4. Let's do 1, 2, and then 4. Notice 4, we have these little brackets here. So that's where the text of the psalm doesn't quite fit. So we have to kind of make things go back and forth. So there's one thing I ask of the Lord, and we go to the next line, only this do I seek. Then we repeat back to the beginning, to live in the house of the Lord all the days of my life. Then we go on to verse 4, the next line, to gaze on the beauty of the Lord, to inquire at his temple. So we have to skip that line. Yeah. This is why in Roman Catholic worship, they do, the psalmody is called the responsorial psalm. And there are 2 interpretations of that. It's either a response, I believe it's this, it's the response to the first reading. Most lay Catholics think about it as a responsorial between a cantor singing the verses and the assembly singing a refrain. I think it's, my opinion is right. So, who am I to tell my Catholic siblings? So let's actually read through verse 1 and we'll kind of be able to discover the sprung meter. Here we go, and 1. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Rest. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Rest. Whom should I dread? Next verse. When those who do evil draw near to devour my flesh, it is they, my enemies and foes, who stumble and fall. Though an army encamp against me, my heart would not fear. Though war break out against me, even then would I trust. Here we go. There is one thing I ask of the Lord, only this do I seek, to live in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze on the beauty of the Lord to inquire at his temple. Yeah. And I think that was probably chosen for artistic reasons. Yeah.
Are there more copies?
We have 8 more copies. Can we share? Are those who could share?
I know there are people who came in.
I made 50 copies, so that's great. Oh, actually, oh, yeah, here are. They were up here. You have 3 extra copies. There's 2 bit. Thank you. All right, listen to the tone, and you can sing it in unison, or you can sing it in parts. Wait, sorry, wrong key. Here we go, verse 1, and... So this was there's a different way to notate this that's what they experimented with in for LBW, and that's what they obviously chose against that. It's complicated, but once you get in the zone, kind of get in the rhythm, it does become kind of meditative because of that rhythm.
I recall this was my early years as a church musician when Shelano was new and was popular thing. And I recall listening to French recordings where they actually did the triplet. Especially in French.
Yeah, that's...
So, but who can argue with Notre Dame?
Yeah, right. Well, and I think part of it is if you have a system, like we're always going to do half, quarter, quarter, long, short, short. Then it just becomes you don't have to sit and rehearse that. Everybody can, if you're dealing with new cantors every week or every day for a daily mass, things like that. So there are reasons why you have a system. So then this you can also see above. This is out of Worship 4, the 4th edition of the GIA hymnal, most recent hymnal worship. And they have a couple different antiphons that you could do that fit the harmony. And there's no indication where the refrain or antiphon would go, so that's up to the musician and the cantor. But they also have a second psalm tone which looks similar to our LBW tone. So in theory, a soloist, you notice maybe in the text little accent marks over some words. So those are the accent marks that would go with this this tone from Conception Abbey, which is similar to the LBW tones, except it has just one moving note. So, just as an example, and then of course you have to omit certain measures. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Of course, the moving the indication of when to move actually happens after the note on the text. It's crazy. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? Let's see. The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Whom shall I dread? Okay, so very similar except with one less note. than LBW style. Okay, moving on to page 2. This is, last week I was talking about the Gregorian psalm tones, of which there are 9 historic psalm tones. There are 2 different versions of those Gregorian psalm tones, one for use at masses, which are a little bit more elaborate, and one for use in the offices, which are a little bit more simplified. They all have different, oh actually I meant to tell this is worship for the hymnal. This, for the Gregorian psalm tones, this comes from an Episcopal resource, the Plain Song Psalter, which utilizes the text from the Book of Common Prayer, which was the basis for LBW Psalter and later the ELW Psalter. The Gregorian psalm tones, we could do a whole session on that. The psalm tones are interesting in that you have, this is psalm tone 1. The first measure is the same, but then you have multiple different endings, possibilities. So this says psalm tone 1 with 10 different endings, for example. And this is, well, psalm tone 2 only has 2 different endings, etc. So you could look at that as an example. I'm not going to spend the time to go over these instructions and how the psalm tones work and each of the names for each aspect of a psalm tone. Almost all of them will start with what's called an intonation, which is, in this case, psalm tone 6 here on page 3. Da-dee-dum. And then you have your first reciting note, and then you have the mediant cadence, and sometimes you have to squeeze in a second note on the cadence in order to fit in a syllable. So that's why it's put in parentheses. And then you have the second half of the psalm tone with the second reciting note, and then the final cadence and the ending. So I chose a psalm that used psalm tone 6. Turn the page. Psalm 77. And this uses another kind of instructional system for when to move. So in this system, the intonation, the first notes of the psalm tone, are only sung on verse 1. And often would just be sung by an individual as functioning as intonation. Okay, here we go. Someone's got to get us started. They'll sing the first line, and then everybody comes in thereafter. Everybody then on verse 2 and 3 and etc. starts on the reciting note. So the next thing is that, look, that's why the first 2 syllables are in italics in this version. The 2 dots over the word will, and you'll see this later on in some of the other verses, those 2 dots indicate to the singer that that one syllable is sung over 2 notes. They were very handy there in actually drawing in the slurs on the psalm tone for that. And then when you have the angled slash, then you move to the next moving notes. And then you just have to figure out when to sing the notes in parentheses. Again, if you do this every day of your life multiple times, you just start to notice like that. It's daunting for those uninitiated. So I'll sing the first line. I will cry aloud to God. And you come in. I will cry aloud and He will hear me. In the day of trouble I sought the Lord. My hands were stretched out by night and did not tire. I refused to be comforted. See, you sang the notes in parentheses without even thinking about it. So sometimes notation gets in the way. Next verse. I think of God, I am restless. I ponder and my spirit faints. You will not let my eyelids close. I am troubled and I cannot speak. I consider the days of old. I remember the And in this psalter, the psalm antiphons are here. They give a generic psalm refrains set to melodies that I think were newly composed by the editors of this. The Gregorian psalm tones, I really warmed to them. Partly, I worked with them a lot in both my master's and doctorate degree. But they're really hard to sing congregationally sometimes, depending on the tone and depending on the method of marking the things. But I think maybe looking forward, sometimes I might want to do these in worship, but in which case we'll have to print the psalm text with the method of something in there. So just be open and aware of that. These are some things I like. I think you might like them too. You did really well at that, yeah? Okay. Do that. Let's look at the next one, Psalm Tone 1. Happy are they who have not walked in the counsel of the wicked, nor lingered in the way of sinners, nor sat in the seats of the scornful. Their delight is in the law of the Lord. Aha! This is why I picked this one. I forgot. Like, what did I do too? Sometimes, if you just have an accented note at the very end and there's no syllables after it, you stay on the note you saw. Okay? What is the law of the Lord? And they meditate on His law day and night. Ah, yeah, just when you thought you knew it. To move on to some other ones, but the other thing is in raining. I didn't know that was already. In practice, this is the way I've done this in various places, where this is where, you notice in LBW, the halfway point of the verse had an asterisk.
Yeah.
That was for, among other things, being able to sing it or speak it responsibly. You knew what the halfway point was to stop. Another aspect of that is that it provides the point for the singers, a point to kind of pause and breathe, and then continue on to the next half of the verse. So the performance practice of these tones would be like, their delight is in the law of the Lord, breath, and they meditate on His law day and night, and then immediately go to the next verse, law day and night. They are like trees planted by streams of water, bearing fruit in due season, with leaves that do not wither. Breath. Everything they do shall prosper. It is not so. So you get into this beautiful rhythm of kind of, you give yourself a time just to pause, take a cleansing breath, meditate for a brief minute on that text. It's a really lovely contemplative way of singing. Page 6, Anglican chants. We have Bill Heisley to thank for me discovering the Anglican chant psalter. When I worked here 25 years ago, it's like, Schwandt, look at this. I've always loved Anglican chant on recordings here in choirs from England and this stuff, singing what developed, but I was told, developed out of the psalm tone method that we just sang, the chant method, developed into a harmonized form of chant, and then became pretty codified in that, if you look at number 216, or Psalm tone 216 on page 6, this is a single psalm tone, which has a half note, and then two moving notes, and then a final. That looks pretty similar to what we've done. But then the second half of the psalm tone in Anglican chant always has an extra measure. Okay? So it's slightly different than what we would know as. Okay? So this can sometimes be a little bit more complicated for congregations to sing. That's why choirs often sing it. You'll notice in this method of pointing of the psalms, you'll see little brackets over two syllables. Those are always two syllables on one note. So the first chunk is always a reciting tone. So come let us, and then sing to the Lord. The sing to would be on the first note of that second, and then Lord is on the third measure. So it's easier to just sing it and then rather than describe it. Come, let us sing to the Lord. Let us shout for joy to the rock of salvation. Come, let us come before His presence with thanksgiving, and raise a loud shout to His songs. Now, the same thing where you have the two dots, that's one syllable over two notes. Here's verse 3. For the Lord is a great God, and a great King above all gods. Now try singing it in 4 parts. That's the whole object of this. Let's do verse 4. In His hand are the caverns of the earth, and the heights of the hills are His also. The sea is His, for He made it, and His hands have molded the dry land. Yeah. It's a little harder, yeah. That's why in the old Red Lutheran, either the old Red Lutheran Hymnal Service Book and Hymnal or TLH, a lot of the liturgical music would be written out Anglican chant, where you would have the text in the body of that, and so you didn't have to jump up and down and see where am I singing. So, it's lovely to sing and lovely to. I'd say it's sometimes lovely to listen to. Very often lovely to listen to. It's not as easy or lovely to sing sometimes. You have to think a lot. But again, if you're in a community, a cathedral, or a school that sings the daily office twice a day, you're cranking through the Psalter, you just get to know all the psalm tones and you can just do it. That's why consistency and repetition in liturgy and ritual is important, because then it becomes embedded in our bodies in a way. This Anglican chant Psalter again makes use of the 1979 Book of Common Prayer translation, and always has an older or traditional Anglican chant psalm tone, and then oftentimes a newer one, which often has some fresher harmonies. So Richard Wayne Dirksen, this is a double psalm tone. So Richard Wayne Dirksen was a musician at the Washington Cathedral for many years. It's really cool. I love it. All right, moving on. Totally now for something completely different. Many churches in American Roman Catholic tradition, their method of responsorial psalmody at Eucharist is in what I call in a new folk style. Composers like Marty Haugen, Michael Jonkas, any myriad number of composers write in a kind of a lyrical, quasi-folk folk style that is not a chant-based style. So they'll often take the Psalms and paraphrase them to fit a meter. So this is Psalm 16. This is again from Worship 4, a GIA hymnal. The antiphon would only be sung by the congregation, and then the verses sung by the cantor or choir. This is Psalm 16, and let's do antiphon 1, and then, because we're Mount Olive, let's sing the verses. Let's sing verse 1, and you can sing in parts as you feel obliged. Okay, antiphon 1, you will show. Down to verse 1. some good things from Mr. Hobby. Totally different kind of contemplative and meditative approach. There's certainly some kind of unusual examples of that style that I make less of, but it's certainly the most common, I think, widely done responsorial psalmody within North America, just by the sheer number of Catholics that are singing this. Page 9. The Wisconsin Synod of Lutheranism is has a fascinating recent liturgical history, I think. They're the most conservative of the major Lutheran branches within North America. And within, I'd say, the last 30 years or so have really gone from being decidedly anti-liturgy, very scholastic kind of Lutheranism, that it's all about the word and ritual was, we don't want to be ritualists like those people in Rome and that. But their recent worship books have really emphatically embraced liturgical renewal. Whether that's happening in actual real life, real time in parishes is I don't know. But they've come out recently with a second edition of their hymnal Christian Worship, and a supplementary volume is a whole other hymnal-sized book of the Psalms, with various different arrangements of different psalms. So this, for example, is Psalm 81C. So there are at least version A, version B, version C, and I think there's some D and E too in there, so that you can have your choice of how to do this. And I've really enjoyed looking at this hymnal and their resources. Even though they don't want to talk to me, I'm fine to talk to the Wells people. And I think probably this change in liturgical structure or liturgical emphases is probably due in no small part probably to the ecumenical work that musicians do together through the Association of Lutheran Church Musicians. Even though we don't talk to each other and can't worship with each other, it's been in the water. So I hope it's accepted. This is from Malawi, and is an interesting multicultural, non-Western type of a refrain. Oh, be joyful. Song tone. Sing for joy to God our strength. Shout aloud to God our Jacob. Hear the music, strike the timbrel. Play the melodious harp and lyre. Oh, be joyful. Oh, be joyful in your hearts. Give thanks to God our Savior. Oh, be joyful in your heart, and give thanks to God our Savior, for God's mercy, everlasting, for God's mercy, everlasting. Something totally different. Yeah, kind of cool. Who would have thought the Wisconsin Synod? In the ELCA's African American hymnal resource from 1999 called This Far by Faith, a composer by the name of Ron Harber wrote a number of psalm refrains in a gospel style and reharmonized some of the LBW psalm tones in a slightly jazzier style. So. Geiger did not write this harmony. Anyway, it's a lot of fun. Now for something even completely wildly indifferent. Hal Hobson of blessed memory, who recently died, put together a big, what I used to call the big red psalter for use in Presbyterian and Methodist churches. This is just something in here for kind of fun, just to show the expansiveness of how psalmody is done in contexts outside of our own. This is like Sprechstimme. If you know music terminology, that's speech that's kind of meant to be dramatic. Okay? Kind of like the Count. You've heard of the fourth choir, yes. So this is a song. I actually did this once, so God. But no, it's actually interesting. It brings a whole new dimension to this psalm. So the congregation sings this refrain. Notice the cantor part. I sing, "Serve the Lord with holy fear. Serve the Lord with holy fear." And then a growly sound on the organ. Joseph, you want to be the narrator?
Why do the nations conspire a rebellion? Why do the leaders muster their troops? The kings of the earth rise up, the princes plot together against the Lord and against the King God chose.
Everybody? Let
us free ourselves from their rule. Let us throw off their control.
Serve the Lord with holy fear. Serve the Lord with holy fear. Anyway, yeah. All right, next one, page 12. The Reformed tradition, Calvinists have a beautiful, very old tradition of the only music they could sing was psalms. And they decided congregationally to do metrical psalms. So translations that were modified to fit meter. They were originally derisively called Geneva jigs because they were a little too fancy. And this is from the Christian Reformed Church in America in 1987, the Psalter hymnal. They're kind of the descendants of that tradition. They sing a lot of these metrical songs. If you notice in a hymnal, the tune name is either like Old 24th or Old 100th, or you see Genevan 16. That number references the psalm to which it was attached to as a tune. So you see down here at the bottom, this hymn tune name is known as Geneva 47, which is the original psalm hymn tune melody for this versification of Psalm 47. And I dare say it does kind of jig. Jig to it, right? Very musically related to German chorales. Now the next collection of things which you're going to breeze through are the vast approach to translations and how they impact what we sing and say and how we understand. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 versions of Psalm 8. So the first is from one of my favorite banned books. Believe it or not, banned by the American Catholic Conference of bishops. In the early 90s, there was work at developing a new translation of the Roman Missal. You may be familiar that in 2010, there was the new translation of the Mass. In the early 90s, there was a work to redo that, and actually it's the better translation, but it got nixed by the conservatives in Rome. Part of that work, I think, by extension, was a reworking of the Psalms and the Psalter for singing, in a desire for an inclusive rendering of the Psalms that was beautiful and not necessarily a literal translation. That was very much the spirit of the second draft of the Roman Missal in English that got suppressed. This is from the Psalter from the International Consultation on English in the Liturgy from 1995, which you really can't get, and they won't allow you to reuse the text because, but I use it anyway because David wrote it. All right. So look at the beauty of the text. You can find these books online. You can buy them on Amazon for your own devotion. They're often elegantly, beautifully made, beautiful. Well, actually, I have it right here. I have all these books here. So this is the banned book. And it's lovely, laid out beautifully. I've used it as inspiration for lots of things. So the psalm that we all know, Psalm 23, the rendering of that is, "The Lord is my shepherd, I need nothing more. You give me rest in green meadows, setting me near calm waters where you revive my spirit." That's actually not as different as we know. Anyway, that's a bad example. But if you look at Psalm 8 here, this is the one I wanted to. "Lord our God, the whole world tells the greatness of your name. Your glory reaches beyond the stars. Even the babble of infants declares your strength, your power to halt the enemy and the avenger. I see your handiwork in the heavens, the moon and the stars you set in place. What is humankind that you remember them, the human race that you care for them. You treat them like gods, dressing them in glory and splendor. You give them charge of the earth, laying all at their feet. Cattle and sheep, wild beasts, bird of the sky, fish of the sea, every swimming creature. Lord our God, the whole world tells the greatness of you." I find it a beautiful translation. The next, and we're wrapping up here quickly, two different metrical versions, seeing how poets have taken Psalm 8 and made it fit a meter. So you see the first one here in 14 is from a new metrical psalter from 1986, and then another one by Michael Morgan. And then yet another one on page 16. This takes a hymn tune, the hymn tune Eventide, which you may know as Abide With Me. He makes that the refrain. For God alone, my soul in silence waits. And then what's called simplified Anglican chant as the psalm tone, where we just have a reciting note and a last note. Last but not least is, well, actually, this is the last version of Psalm 8. This is the ELW approved version. So there's two psalm tones that we have in a resource called Psalms for the Church Year and Congregational Antiphons, done by a myriad of composers. So you can take time to compare how different authors and translators have translated the words of Psalm 8. Lastly is Taizé. You maybe know the music of and Taizé. This is an ostinato that the assembly would sing. My soul is at rest in God alone. And then the verses would be sung by a soloist on top of that. Again, kind of meditative and contemplative. Again, this is from the Wisconsin Synod hymnal. This is the Psalter of Christian worship that goes aside with that. So that's kind of a cursory overview of just how many different ways there are to sing psalms, and who knew? And happy to talk more about these at some point. But my choir has been instructed at 10:20 and to go upstairs. So thank you all.